I know people are still introducing, but I'm going to go. This is the Breaking the Idols, Nuclear Weapons and Intersectional Justice breakout session. We've seen in recent years the US government choosing to dump billions of dollars into producing, testing, and deploying nuclear weapons. And that has, of course, been going on since the beginnings of the Cold War in the 1940s. In this session, we'll be looking at the effects of nuclear weapons. How does it distort our economy? How does it hurt or impact our environment? And what is the racial justice component of this? And maybe most importantly, because we're starting with it, we'll talk about how breaking the idolatry of the bomb can move us closer to building the beloved community. If you have any doubts that we do practice idolatry in nuclear things, all we need to do is look at the way that the Biden administration added money to the outrageous Trump request for nuclear weapons and the whole overall Pentagon budget. And then Congress, the Senate anyway, just went and added billions more. So on that unpeaceful note, I'm going to introduce each of our three panelists, starting with Art Laffin, who is a long-term activist. In fact, he recently updated, after 40 years, a book he first wrote in cooperation with two other people in 1979-80. Unfortunately, there wasn't as much updating to the reflections on our nuclear obsession as there was to the biblical scholarship that underlies really the book's reflection on what the gospel means in a nuclear age. Art is himself a Plowshares, I don't know what the word is, a proud Plowshares survivor, participant, veteran, and a long-term activist. He is with the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker in Washington, D.C. And I'd be remiss not to tell you that Art, too, is a Pax Christi teacher of peace. So Art, I'm going to turn things over to you in a minute, but first, our second speaker will be Vincent Intondi. Vincent, maybe many of you know as the author of a wonderful book, African Americans Against the Bomb, Nuclear Weapons, Colonialism, and the Black Freedom Movement. He is currently a professor of history and the director of the Institute for Race, Justice, and Civic Engagement at Montgomery College in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Previously, he was director of research for American University's Nuclear Studies Institute in Washington, D.C. And he also taught at Seminole State College in Sanford, Florida. If you haven't heard Vincent before, I can tell you he is a great speaker and he knows his stuff inside out. Our final panelist, as they say, last but not least, is Vicki Elson. Vicki is, I'm going to blow this, I just know, but Vicki is the co-founder of Nuclear Ban USA, along with her partner, Dr. Tim Wallace, with whom I've worked. And Nuclear Ban USA does political work at the city, state, and federal level to promote the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And Vicki and Tim also co-founded treatyawareness.us, which works both on an educational level and to support citizens pressuring the profiteering corporations through divestment, shareholder action, and compelling communication with executives and employees. She's currently the executive director of both of those organizations, and she's coming to us from Brussels, Belgium, where she and Tim have recently moved to work with the Quaker Council on European affairs. So with all of those introductions, I'm going to turn this over to Art first, who will talk about breaking the idols and how to do it. You're on, Art. You need to unmute there.
Thank you, Nick. I want to express my deep appreciation to Johnny and Lauren, Edward, Roxana, and the entire Pax Christi USA staff for organizing this national conference. And I'm honored to be a presenter in this workshop with Vicki Elson and Vincent Intondi, and deeply grateful to Nick for moderating it. All things are possible for one who has faith. I do believe, help my unbelief. These two lines, Mark's Gospel's account of Jesus healing the possessed boy, are key to sustaining our hope as people of faith committed breaking and overcoming the idolatry of nuclear weapons. If we have the faith to believe that miracles can occur and act on that faith, it can happen, as evidenced by the healings Jesus performed. But healing is contingent on having the faith to believe that the miracle is possible in the first place. The father of the possessed boy believes Jesus can heal his son, yet he still confesses his unbelief. Jesus recognizes the sincerity of the father, and this becomes the catalyst for Jesus to heal his son. How many of us can identify with the father of the boy who says, I do believe, help my unbelief? I know I can. Regarding the nation's addiction to violence and the bomb, do we really believe we can break and overcome the nuclear idol? Tragically, we live in a world where violence and killing has become the norm. Normalization of evil is what renowned psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, who coined the term psychic numbing, defines as malignant normality, where the abnormal becomes normal. Thank God for the many people and groups, including Pax Christi USA, who has resisted this malignant normality in all its guises. Jesus instructs us that all things are possible for one who has faith, and that faith in God, who commands us to love and never to kill, is the antidote to overcoming the idols, fears, illusions, lies, and paralysis that prevent us in our society from establishing God's reign of love, justice, and peace. Yet the powers, and so many still choose to embrace the myth of redemptive violence and the nuclear idol. To extricate ourselves from this evil, we must fully confront and unmask it, repent for our own complicity in it, and act to resist it. Nuclear weapons derive from a long history of human sinfulness, from the first time brother killed brother. The sin of moral blindness wraps itself around the basic death intention, obscuring at its heart the ultimate sin nurtured there, the choice of death over life. To be credible, the threat of using nuclear weapons presupposes the intention of using them. It recommends annihilation of total societies, untold casualties, nuclear winter, famine, a cancer pandemic, and an uninhabitable earth as a solution to the problems of competing ideologies and economic interests. The destructive potential of nuclear war is so vast that we cannot comprehend the extent of the evil we have created. Moreover, nuclear weapons serve to reinforce systems of white supremacy, racism, oppression, and military intervention and occupation. The nation is morally blind to the evil that has been created and justified in the name of national security. Any trust that people in the state put in nuclear weapons is trust displaced from God. The bomb is a substitute God, an idol to which godlike authority is assigned. The state surrounds it with an aura of secrecy, reverence, and finality. This dependence on nuclear weapons for our security is known as nuclearism. Nuclearism has virtually become a national religion, and it constitutes idolatry. By their very nature, the 13,400 nuclear weapons possessed by the 9 nuclear nations are genocidal instruments of mass murder. The US and Russia have a combined total of 12,600 nuclear weapons, and both countries are modernizing and expanding their nuclear forces. Each side possesses a first strike capability with many weapons on hair trigger alert. At any moment, these weapons, by direct order or miscalculation, could be used. The US refuses to adopt a no first use policy, despite international treaties that prohibit their use and now their possession. The nuclear intention rooted in our heart and the worldwide proliferation of murderous weapons spawned claim hosts of victims daily. These are the victims of gross neglect, the starving of the world, many of whom are children. The unfed, the diseased, the poor become the holy innocents, sacrifices before the nuclear idol. I witness firsthand every Thursday in the Feast on the Street ministry in Washington, the victims who suffer most because of misplaced priorities, the homeless poor, and there are increasing numbers of homeless in encampments, not only in DC, but across the country. On January 1st of this year, Pope Francis, in his World Day of Peace message, appealed for the creation of an international fund whereby military expenditures will be redirected to alleviate poverty and meet urgent human needs. Tragically, on this same day, Congress passed a $740 billion military budget. For the fiscal year 2022 budget, the Biden administration is requesting $43 billion for nuclear weapons. This is part of a 30-year, $1.7 trillion nuclear modernization program that the United States nuclear arsenal is currently underway. These expenditures are a theft from the poor and a sin and a crime. In this pandemic time, all current nuclear and military expenditures should now be used as a stimulus package for the world's poor. The Bulletin of the Scientist has turned its doomsday clock to 100 seconds before midnight due to the existential threats posed by nuclear weapons and the climate crisis. With the future of human survival and our planet's existence at stake, how can we avert global catastrophe and bring about nuclear abolition? First and foremost, we must have the faith and believe that it can occur. We must summon the courage to stop the national addiction to the nuclear idol by placing our trust in God and renouncing the nuclear sin. If we are to take seriously the magnitude of the nuclear and the admonitions of Pope Francis, who has declared that the very possession of nuclear weapons is immoral, we must risk taking action that is commensurate with the colossal threat we face. If it is wrong to possess nuclear weapons, then it is equally wrong to use them. Thus, no Catholic or Christian should participate in the chain of command to ever use them. Can followers of Jesus be employed in nuclear weapons-related work? The following insights from Catholic peacemakers serve to counsel us on this matter. Father Richard McSorley stated, quote, "It's a sin to build a nuclear weapon. We cannot seriously imagine Jesus pushing the button to launch a nuclear bomb, or registering for the draft, or wearing the uniform of any nation state, or paying taxes for nuclear weapons, or working in a plant that manufactures weapons of death." Dorothy Day, Dan and Phil Berrigan, and so many other Christian peacemakers have made this same appeal. The late Bishop Leroy Matheson made this appeal to Catholics in his diocese who worked at the Pantex nuclear weapons plant in Amarillo, Texas. Quote, "In the name of the God of peace, quit your jobs." He said he would try to offer financial assistance to any defense worker who would quit. And the late Archbishop Raymond Hunthausen of the Seattle Diocese declared, quote, "We need to find our way back to the way of nonviolence, which Jesus calls us to. God calls us to name the evil our society has embraced so wholeheartedly in our nuclear arms, and to do so clearly. Trident is the Auschwitz of Puget Sound. I say with deep sorrow that our nuclear war preparations are the global crucifixion of Jesus. Our nuclear weapons are the final crucifixion of Jesus in the extermination of the human family with whom he has won. We have to refuse to give incense in our day, tax dollars, to our nuclear idol. We also need to heed and act on the plea of the Habakasha, the A-bomb survivors. During the ceremony that awarded the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize to the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, Suzeko Thurlow, Hiroshima survivor and ICAN member, spoke these words in her acceptance speech, quote, "I speak as a member of the family of the Habakasha, those of us who by some miraculous chance survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For more than 7 decades, we have worked for the total abolition of nuclear weapons. We were not content to be victims. We shared our stories of survival. We said humanity and nuclear weapons cannot coexist. Today, I want you to feel the presence of all those who perished in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I want you to feel above all and around us a great cloud of 250,000 souls. Each person had a name. Each person was loved by someone. Let us ensure that their deaths were not in vain. These weapons are not a necessary evil. They are the ultimate evil. Ultimately, if true disarmament is to occur, we must repent of the nuclear sin. Such acts of repentance have already taken place, whereby U.S. Christians have apologized to the Japanese for the nuclear atrocities committed against them. And I want to acknowledge here our brother, Father Bob Cushing, who has led delegations to Japan in that work of repentance. The nuclear challenge before us is great but not insurmountable, for with God, all things are possible. Drawing on the rich biblical tradition of nonviolent resistance, Plowshares activists have been inspired to carry out over 100 disarmament actions since 1980, whereby nuclear swords, the nuclear idols, have symbolically been beaten into plowshares. The most recent Plowshares action, the Kings Bay Plowshares 7, declared in their action statement, quote, "Nuclear weapons eviscerate the rule of law, enforce white supremacy, perpetuate endless war and environmental destruction, and ensure impunity for all manner of crimes against humanity." Dr. King said the ultimate logic of racism is genocide. We say the ultimate logic of Trident is omnicide. In October 2019, they were tried and convicted by a jury of 3 felonies and a misdemeanor, and all 7 have served or are now serving prison terms ranging from 8 months to 3 years. There have also been other peace actions which people attending this conference have participated in over the decades. I have been blessed to be part of actions, including 2 Plowshares actions directed at the first Strike Trident submarine. I, along with many other peacemakers, believe that if people have the faith to believe that nuclear abolition is possible and act on that faith, it can occur. The churches have a crucial role to play in breaking the idolatry of the bomb and bringing about a disarmed world. What if churches could take the lead in calling for the conversion of industries to non-military production? What if the U.S. bishops and all Christians in the U.S. joined with the Don't Bank on the Bomb network and demanded that all banks divest of any nuclear weapons related money they hold, and that the U.S. government ratify the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which now makes nuclear weapons illegal under international law? This would go a long way in creating the climate needed to bring about nuclear abolition. This August 6th to 9th, which marks the 76th anniversary of the criminal US nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there will be commemorative actions worldwide calling for nuclear abolition. In the presence of all who perished, remembrance in the age of the Ban Treaty is the theme for actions that are being coordinated by the US Days of Action Working Group. I encourage everyone attending this session to participate in one of these actions in your area. As part of this witness in the DC area, The Dorothy Day Catholic Worker, members of Pax Christi, and other peace will hold vigils at the White House and the Pentagon. Now is the time to act with people worldwide working for disarmament and nonviolent social transformation. Dr. King exhorts us, the choice today is either nonviolence or non-existence. Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. If the human family and earth are to survive, if the children are to have a future, we need to recapture the hope and revolutionary spirit that Dr. King speaks to. Moreover, we need to commit our lives to the commandment of gospel nonviolence as we join with others seeking to make God's reign of love, peace, and justice a reality for our world. Breaking the idolatry of the bomb and working for nuclear abolition, racial, social, environmental, and economic justice can and will move us closer to creating the beloved community. Thank you for listening to me. And I look forward to hearing Vicki and Vincent.
Thanks, Art. Can you just hold up the book so I can plug it? I mentioned Art's book and forgot to give you the title, The Risk of the Cross, Living Gospel Nonviolence in the Nuclear Age. I'm happy to announce that this book, which is available from 23rd Publications, is going to be the subject of Pax Christi's next book study. And that will begin sometime in the fall. We haven't finalized the dates yet. And it's frankly a great way to prepare for this January when the banned treaty member states will meet for the first annual review of the treaty. The treaty came into force a year ago, the end of this coming October, and they've postponed a little bit the conference of member states to review progress because of COVID, but it's happening. And as a run-up to that, this book is going to be the Pax Christi National Book Study. Thanks, Art. I appreciate everything you've said. Folks, if you have questions, we'll do them after all of the presentations are done. And saying that, the next person who's going to present is Vincent Intondi. And Vincent, I'll let you have the floor here, please.
Thanks so much, Nick. I'm going to keep my remarks brief because I'd much rather be in a discussion with all of you guys and hear your thoughts and your questions on these topics. And I want to thank everybody that organized this and everybody that's participating in this and here, especially in an off year. You know, when it's the 75th anniversary of the atomic bombings, 60th anniversary, et cetera, there's a lot of events, there's a lot of attention in the disarmament community. But in the off years, we don't see as much attention. We don't have as many events and things of this nature. And for the Habaksha, they don't get a day off. They don't get to forget the horror and what happened to them. So it's so important that on a year like this, the 76th anniversary, that we are still making sure people know about what happened, what Truman did, and how we can make sure it never happens again. And, you know, when we think back of slavery in this country, of course, the Civil War didn't just happen, right? Lincoln was pushed, as every president has been pushed to act. And when we look at slaves in this country, we do talk about the larger slave rebellions, Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey, the work of John Brown. But it was the day-to-day acts of resistance that were equally important and that got us to the Civil War and then ultimately freedom for slaves. Things like when slaves refused to work, when they learned to talk in code, when they learned to become, when they made the decision to, under these circumstances, to read and write, breaking tools, faking illness, running away, shuffling their feet and learning and dancing when they were not supposed to. All of these day-to-day acts of resistance collectively mattered. And I say that because right now, our education system and talking about civil rights and talking about nuclear disarmament is under attack. They call it critical race theory. They want to change the curriculums, change what we can teach our kids in school. And so just you guys being here today, just us teaching our children about what happened here, is in and of itself an act of resistance. And so again, I want to thank you for being here in this act of resistance to learn about the intersections of race and nuclear weapons. And the reason that I set out to study this and really made this the focus of my first book and other writings and teachings is because, especially when you look at African-American history, for so long that history was written by rich, white, racist males. And they were only looking at it from their point of view. It wasn't until the late 1960s when you had the Black Arts Movement, when you had Sonia Sanchez and Nikki Giovanni and Gil Scott-Heron and Miri Baraka, when you had students in colleges saying, we want history taught from our point of view. This is when you saw the rise of Black studies and Chicano studies and Native American studies in schools. And so there is still a lot that we are studying and finding out and writing about this history. And so when I look at African-American history, I saw a giant brick wall. And when it came to the issue of the bomb and nuclear studies, there was a big brick missing in that wall that I wanted to fill in, that I thought was necessary to get that narrative correct. And so in writing this book, my hope was that people would come to it maybe interested in nuclear studies of the peace movement and learn about African-American history. Or those students I have that are interested in Malcolm and Martin and Lorraine Hansberry and so many others would come to this book and then learn about the issue of the bomb. And so when we dropped the atomic bomb on August 6, 1945 in Hiroshima, 3 days later on Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands of people, the US reaction, Gallup ran a poll a week after the atomic bombings in which 85% of the American public agreed with Truman's decision to use nuclear weapons in Japan. In fact, Roper ran a poll a week after that in which 22% of the American public wished Japan hadn't surrendered so we could have dropped more nuclear weapons and killed more people. No poll up until late October of 1945 ever showed more than 4.5% of the American public criticizing or questioning Truman's decision. And that is because in this country, we had a genocidal race hatred against the people of Japan that was unprecedented in our country. Far worse than even the hatred we had towards people of Middle Eastern descent after 9/11. And we didn't do this with the Germans. We were very careful in our literature and the cartoons and the media to separate Germans from Nazis. We separate fascists from Italians. But after Pearl Harbor, the entire country of Japan was deemed guilty. And so they are depicted as vermin and yellow monkeys, subhumans, right? And when you make somebody or a group of people less than human, it makes it easier to commit violence against them, right? Because we're not actually dropping atomic bombs on mothers and fathers and sons and daughters. No, we're doing this on people that are less than human, subhuman, right? It is the same thing we did with slaves, right? We had to justify slavery. And so we say that they are subhuman. They're biologically inferior. Africans are unchristian, uncivilized. And so it makes it easier to justify this system that we are creating. We did it again with Vietnam, with with North Korea. We constantly do this with the Middle East, right? What do we do with immigration? And do we see mothers and fathers and sons and daughters? No, we call them aliens. And once we make that jump and call them aliens, then they're not fully human. And it's easier to say electrocute them all at the border and put them in cages and so on and so forth. Right? Look at the images in the Middle East. Do we see human beings? Do we see students and children? No, they find the most bombastic image they can find. Someone screaming Allah Akbar. They don't look like us or talk like us or smell like us or dress like us. So the translation is not fully human. And it makes it easier to say bomb them all, right? Yeah, I remember General Joseph Stilwell, when I was researching this, wrote a letter to his wife after Pearl Harbor in which he said, quote, when I think of how these bow-legged cockroaches have ruined our calm lives, it makes me want to wrap Jap guts around every lamppost in Asia. And so in researching this, it was Langston Hughes who came out first publicly and challenged and questioned Truman's own deep-seated racism in his decision to use nuclear weapons in Japan. And he was right to do so. Truman isn't the most racist president we ever had. We may have just had that, but certainly was one of those. This is a man who Truman constantly in his letters to his wife Bess and in his journals rarely referred to African Americans as anything other than the N-word. This is a man who used to brag in interviews that in his family, when you got married, you got slaves as a wedding present to start out the housekeeping with. His mother openly supported the Confederacy, and when she visited him at the first time at the White House, said she'd rather sleep on the floor than ever step foot in Lincoln's bedroom. He actually sent a $10 check to join the Ku Klux Klan, but they sent it back to him because he refused to fire the Catholic workers at one of his businesses in Missouri. And when the atomic bomb was dropped and he was instantly told that 150,000 people of color were instantly killed, the first thing he did was jump up in the air and say, quote, "This is the greatest thing in history." So we don't know how much of his racism played a role, but it certainly played a role in his decision to use nuclear weapons. And it wasn't just Langston Hughes. You found in the original, as soon as the bomb was dropped, there were members of the Black press, there were members of the Black clergy that were speaking out against Truman's decision to use nuclear weapons. It was the great Paul Robeson, who has been so forgotten in our history, speaking in June of 1946 to 20,000 people in Madison Square Garden, where he asked the question, where is the United States getting the uranium to build nuclear weapons? And the answer, of course, was the Belgian-controlled Congo. He saw how colonialism was equally part of this in terms of race and in terms of nuclear weapons. So as I studied all of this history, I don't know how anybody can say that racism or race is not inextricably linked with nuclear weapons. When we look at nuclear testing, who has been the victims of nuclear testing? It has been Native Americans. It has been French. The French are now, Macron's still apologizing for what they did in Polynesia. It is the Marshall Islands, right? It was in 1959 when the French government wanted to be a nuclear power. Where did they say they were going to test their first nuclear weapon? In the Sahara, in Africa. Right when Algeria was coming to independence, right when Ghana was coming to independence with the rise of Nkrumah. And the people in Ghana feared what that nuclear test would do in terms of fallout to the cocoa industry. And so it was Bayard Rustin, the great organizer in this country, who was so, again, marginalized and iced out of our history because he was gay. It was Rustin who saw how these things came together and put a team of activists in the US and in Africa and in the UK and went there to try to stop the French government from testing their first nuclear weapon. He saw how these things were all related. When we look at Kazakhstan, when we look at Australian Aborigines, always a people of color who are victims when it comes to nuclear testing. When we look at, say, how nuclear weapons are being built, right? Look at the Savannah River Project and the history there of how African Americans were used throughout the Cold War and told the jobs they were given were to clean up nuclear spills in these factories, given no protective equipment at all and filled with cancer and had no health care, segregated in their housing in these various communities where nuclear weapons were being made. If we look at African American veterans, they were used often as nuclear guinea pigs after World War II, where we tested nuclear weapons on them and then did not admit what happened to them or give them any kind of recognition. I was so pleased to see that President Biden just recently announced that July, I believe was the 25th, was now Atomic Veterans Day in this country, finally giving them the long overdue recognition that they deserve. And so we see this all throughout our history, that connection of African Americans, of race and nuclear weapons. Of course, as we already heard a little bit about Dr. King. Dr. King was speaking out against nuclear weapons as early as 1957, learning so much of that from his wife, Coretta, who was a long season activist dating back to her days at Antioch College, dating back to when she was in Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. And so again, he understood how those triple evils were connected, of racism and militarism and nuclear weapons, capitalism. And we see this especially throughout the 1980s. The new book that I'm writing now and the project I've been working on is looking at the 1980s, looking at the nuclear freeze movement, but especially looking at the June 12th, 1982 rally. Because again, for so long, we are told that this issue is only for, and the only people that care about it are white middle-class supporters. And that's simply not true. If we look at this history, you will see diverse voices have always been there. And the June 12th, 1982 rally, when over 1 million people were in Central Park demanding an end to the nuclear arms race, we see that again. 50% of the leadership that day was African-American, led by the great Reverend Herbert Daughtry in New York. You had thousands of people pouring out of Bed-Stuy and Harlem, people like Ruby Dee and Ozzie Davis and Chaka Khan and Dick Gregory, all speaking there against the bomb, performing. So this issue has always been in the Black community. And it's shifted in terms of reasoning. You know, for many in the Black community, especially in the 1980s, they saw how Reagan was spending all of this money on nuclear weapons and then cutting all of the programs that helped the poor and helped economically depressed communities, right? Much like we see today with the nuclear budget and so on and so forth. And so, as I've written and talked so much about race and nuclear weapons throughout my life, I will admit that it has been difficult over the last 5-6 years. You know, as somebody that has dedicated my life to eliminating racism and eliminating nuclear weapons, and then having a racist white supremacist as our president for 4 years with our nuclear arsenal and able to end life on the planet by himself, to look and see him and Putin, two white nationalist authoritarian leaders with 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal. And then to see what happens to George Floyd and so many others, yeah, it has made me think, have we failed, right? What do we do? But I made a promise to the Hibaksha long ago that I would never stop fighting on this issue. And so I have grappled with, have we been successful or not on this front? But the thing that I keep taking away is that we have to look beyond our generation. That the reality is that racism and nuclear weapons will be here when I die. But can I make sure that there's fewer nuclear weapons and less racism on this planet than when I came into it? And that's all I can do. And so I return back to those slaves that I mentioned earlier, the little acts of resistance, right? And then there are the big acts. And there are the big acts of resistance, like the June 12th march when 1 million people were in the streets. There are the big acts of resistance today when we are out there protesting and marching. But there are the day-to-day acts of resistance that we can do in our everyday lives to say, did we do everything we could to eliminate racism and to eliminate nuclear weapons? From what we wear, to who we befriend, to what we watch, to what we read, to what we eat, to what we listen to. All of those day-to-day acts of resistance, and collectively they can lead to change. Every president has been pushed. You know, King would often say the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, but not unless we are the ones that are actually bending it. And when we look at the juxtaposition of where we were with Trump and Putin, but then to see over 120 nations, mostly of the global South, people of color, signing on, ratifying, and saying no more nuclear weapons with ICANN and with this nuclear weapons ban treaty. That shows what is possible. South Africa eliminated their nuclear weapons program. They eliminated apartheid. Are they perfect? No, but they showed it can be done. And if you would have told slaves that we would have had a Black president, they would have said, you're out of your mind. There's no way that is going to happen. It can be done. So it is imperative that we just believe that it can be done. But believing's not enough. Hope is not enough. We need to take that and we need to work every day. Everybody in this room has gifts. I can't draw a stick figure to save my life. I can't play a musical instrument. I have no artistic ability whatsoever. I have my voice, my ability to write. But you all have gifts, and what you do with it, that is your gift back. So thank you so much for inviting me here. I look forward to having a lively discussion with you all, and thanks again.
Thanks very much, Vincent. Thank you very much. Again, I posted, there's several good comments, and I posted a link to a site where you can actually watch videos of the Hibaksha telling their stories. It's very, very powerful. He introduced her. She's going to be looking particularly at the impact of our nuclear obsession on the environment and climate change. And I believe Vicki has a slideshow to go along. So we're not just talking heads after all. Okay, Vicki, it's yours.
Thanks, Nick. And boy, I'm really honored to be in such good company here today. Thank you so much. I was working on a title for this little talk, The Intersection of Existential Threats, the Danger of False Solutions, and the Joy of Participating in Real Solutions. And as you can see, I wasn't sure if anybody was really going to listen to anything with such a dry title. So this was what happened when I tried to make it more exciting. That wasn't good enough. How about just boiling it down to the essentials? You know, no nukes, no fossil fuels, no brainer. And then I started thinking about, well, what if I called on the wisdom and the insights of the ancestors? And I still haven't quite come up with the right title for this talk. But we do have an intersection of all these problems. And we have, as our other speakers have described, the climate crisis, nuclear weapons, unsustainable inequality and injustice, all intersecting. And one way they intersect is that inequality and injustice can lead to war, which can escalate into nuclear war. The climate crisis can lead to war, which can escalate into nuclear war. One thing that not everybody is aware of is that nuclear weapons, even a small nuclear war like between India and Pakistan, there's a study that shows that that would kick enough soot into the atmosphere to ruin crops and starve 2 billion human beings. So nuclear weapons can actually cause climate crisis. As our other speakers have so beautifully already explained, the worst effects of nuclear weapons and the climate crisis affect the most vulnerable people. Meanwhile, of course, the money that we're wasting on nuclear weapons is being sucked out of money we could be spending on green technologies to address the climate crisis, and also out of ways that we could address poverty and inequality. All of this is happening in a context where all three of these problems have the same root causes. On the part of the 1%, we have corporate greed, political corruption, short-sightedness, and propaganda. And to a lesser extent, the rest of us suffer from ignorance, apathy, powerlessness, and just trying to get through the day. Not having enough time to focus on these existential threats. So all of these have similar root causes. Here's another intersection. On the left, you see the top greenhouse gas emitters on the planet. And you'll notice that the top 5 are nuclear armed nations. Number 5 through 12 are part of the USA nuclear umbrella. Number 13, 14, and 15 are nuclear armed nations. And that just leaves Israel and North Korea as nuclear armed nations that are not in the top 15 greenhouse gas emitters. So what does this mean? These are the culprits for both of these problems. And again, if we were to eliminate nuclear weapons in line with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is an incredible new tool, we could work together perhaps as well to limit our greenhouse gas emissions. Both climate and nuclear weapons suffer from the problem of false solutions. In the case of the climate emergency, nuclear power is a false solution. Radioactive accidents and waste, it's extremely expensive to have nuclear power. And even if it were a good solution, it would take so long to build enough new power plants that we just don't have time. Biomass and biofuels are promoted as solutions. They are not. They emit plenty of carbon, and the whole carbon neutral loophole is a scam. Carbon capture and storage are also promoted as solutions. These things don't work yet. We don't have the technology yet. Again, they're very, very expensive, and they legitimize more fossil fuel burning. Oh, we can just capture the carbon and store it somehow magically. So the false solutions for nuclear weapons, one of them is arms control. Really, only total abolition can guarantee safety from nuclear weapons. Arms control simply is not enough. Non-proliferation sounds good, but really all it is keeping other countries from getting nuclear weapons, and it doesn't address the existing ones that we have. No first use sounds good. Let's not start a nuclear war. But it's not enough by itself. It doesn't eliminate any nuclear weapons, and it doesn't challenge deterrence theory. How about just keeping a few nuclear weapons around as a deterrent? Well, no. Even one nuclear weapon, and as we've heard, there are more than 13,000 of them on the planet, even one is unthinkably dangerous, and deterrence is a myth. Deterrence is a theory that has not been proved or disproved, but most scholars now agree that it's just simply a myth, and we've just been incredibly lucky so far. It is, in fact, deterrence is the world's biggest game of chicken. And given that there have already been 13 incidents where we came as close to World War III as in the Cuban Missile Crisis, given that there have been 1,000 accidents that could have resulted in detonation, what could possibly go wrong? So we do have real solutions. We have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and we have the Green New Deal. It is, if you think about it, you know, of all of the things that are threatening our survival right now, the one that we could end today if we had the political will is nuclear war. All we have to do is take the warheads off the delivery systems, off the missiles, out of the submarines. We could end that threat today and get to work on the others. And that is in fact what the world wants. The world has spoken. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has been now ratified in 55 countries. It's gone up since I made this slide. It makes everything to do with nuclear weapons illegal, everything. Developing, testing, producing, manufacturing, transferring, stationing, possessing, stockpiling, financing. That's all illegal in 55 countries so far. And it's also a new global norm, which is a form of making it illegal globally. The corporations that make nuclear weapons may find themselves in violation of the law in those 55 countries. And we really kind of like to point that out to them. We like to go to nuclear weapons companies and remind them that if they want to stay in business, they have to get with the times. We like to go and post copies of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and little notices, just letting them know, like, this business is doomed. And whether it ends because we don't exist or whether it ends because we stop making nuclear weapons and make them illegal and take them apart, the business is going to end one way or the other. Which side of history do you want to be on? We're here to help. So we've always had this dream of a world without nuclear weapons all my life. Now with the Nuclear Ban Treaty, it's the law. We have a dove with teeth. The Green New Deal and the Nuclear Ban Treaty have a lot of great solutions in common, great attributes in common. They both address an existential threat. They're both large scale, bold, and comprehensive. They both go far beyond the failed incremental steps that have been frustrating us for generations. They both hopefully avoid false solutions, and they both improve the lives of the most vulnerable. And most beautifully, they both work with the rest of the world and can help increase cooperation and goodwill so we can get on with solving the other existential crises. So what if we took the billions of dollars that are wasted on nuclear weapons and the best scientists and the best engineers and all that infrastructure that's wasted on nuclear weapons of mass extinction, and we shifted it over to the Green New Deal? We'd create lots and lots of jobs and save lots and lots of lives. What if there were a federal law that mandated this conversion? In fact, there is. It's called HR 2850, introduced by Representative Eleanor Holmes Norton from Washington, D.C. It's the Nuclear Weapons Abolition and Economic and Energy Conversion Act of 2021. I love this picture. It's my favorite picture, really. That's me on the right, and that's my husband, Tim, on the left. And that's Representative Norton holding the bill. And that's Beatrice Finn, the executive director of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, holding the Nobel Peace Prize, which, by the way, she says we all share when we work on this issue. So if your representative is on this list of co-sponsors, thank them and urge them to get their colleagues on board. If they're not on this list, please encourage your representative to co-sponsor this very important federal legislation. My husband, Tim, wrote this wonderful report that supports Eleanor Holmes Norton's bill. It's a couple of years old, so some things have changed since it was written, but it is available on the website, nuclearban.us, and all those links are already in the chat, by the way, for all these solutions and organizations, along with, I see other people posted ARIPA and some other very good resources, so you have lots of choices. My favorite part of the report is this illustration showing that if we took all the nuclear weapons jobs of mass extinction and shifted them to jobs in green technologies to address climate change and save the world twice over, look how many more jobs that would make in an industry of sustaining life. So we are working on some interconnected strategies to abolish nuclear weapons, political support to get representatives signed on to the ICANN pledge to support the treaty and also the Norton bill. So nuclearban.us is working on those things. And at treatyawareness.us, we're working on public education to bust myths and shift paradigms. And we're also working on pressuring the profiteers to stop business as usual. And that's with both divestment and with contacting the profiteers directly. So you can help shift the money and the brain power wasted on nuclear weapons of mass extinction. I'm trying to shift, there it goes, okay, to green technologies that we need. You can spread the word, let people know about the treaty. You can write to your legislators, ask them to sign the pledge. You can write to the president, ask him to welcome the nuclear ban treaty. He could sign it today if he wanted to, President Biden could. It's just a matter of the political will, and that would start the ball rolling. And it would involve the other 8 nuclear armed nations in negotiations. The treaty lays out a pathway. We sign the treaty, we negotiate with the other countries, we start taking the warheads off the windmill, off the nuclear weapons delivery systems, and we could be done with this era. You can get your city and town involved. A number of cities and towns have already passed legislation that aligns with the treaty. You can divest your own money or your organization's money from the companies that make nuclear weapons. There's only a couple dozen companies to divest from. So this slide right here is in the chat already. It's a list of organizations that you might want to get involved with, along with the other ones that are also in the chat, or talk to Steve Baggerly. A lot of people are doing good work. However much this matters to you, spend a proportional amount of time doing some things. And, you know, as Vincent said, we all have to do a little bit, and it will add up and it'll make a huge difference. I do think we can get rid of nuclear weapons in our lifetime. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Vicki. There's a lot of information. Remember, this meeting is being recorded and you can save the chat as well. At this point, we have about 40 minutes left, and what I'd like to do is entertain questions. But first, let me thank all 3 of our presenters for the time and effort they put in and preparing and the passion. Let's not forget the passion in preparing their presentations. If you have a question, I'd ask you to please put it in the chat, whether you do that as a personal message to me or to Heather, or whether you send it to everyone. And I will try to actually fulfill the role of moderator rather than just hosting. Well, while we're waiting, I have a question for each of the three of you. And that question is, was there a single event or encounter that, moved you to start acting to abolish nuclear weapons? And if it was, and you're willing to share, what was that encounter, incident, what have you? Any one of the three of you, please.
Go ahead, Vicki, I'll follow you.
Okay, that's actually my favorite question. When I had my first child, she was born and she came out of my body, which was like totally mind-blowing. And I held her on my chest and she peed on me and she pooped on me and I loved her just as much. And I realized this is a new kind of relationship. That was a huge revelation for me. And the next thing I realized, like a moment later, was that I would do anything to protect her. And that this is a scary world. And I wanted to protect her. And I especially wanted to protect her from my greatest fear, nuclear weapons. So I spent decades talking to therapists about how to deal with this neurotic fear that I couldn't do anything about. And then fast forward, I'm on the 4th date with a new guy. He takes me to the UN, and I happen to be there the day that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is agreed by 122 countries. And I'm there in the UN with Hibakusha, who've survived this 72 years before and have been working on it their entire lives. And the ambassadors negotiating the treaty broke all the rules about not standing up and clapping and all that. They were all going wild with ecstasy that this had finally happened. And that was the moment, I said, oh, I hadn't somehow gotten plugged into other nuclear weapons work that had been going on my whole life. I got plugged in then, and I married the guy, and we started these organizations, and it's been a huge joy and a huge relief to me to have concrete things that we can do, and to meet all of you, and to meet people who've been doing this for a long, long time, and we're all sharing this passion together. That was the moment that got me. I was hooked.
Thanks, Vicki. For me, it was, I'd been an activist my whole life, mostly revolving around civil rights issue and the Black freedom movement. Nuclear weapons wasn't really on my radar. Like a lot of young kids, I thought they were boring, abstract, nobody would be crazy enough to use them. And that changed the first time I went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So my first trip there was back in 2005, I think. And I was filled with so much anger, so much guilt about what my country had done. And I was there with American University, and we partnered with Ritz-Macon University. And so there's about, 30 or 40 US students, 30 or 40 Japanese students were all together throughout this whole trip. And I remember the night of August 6th, there's the lantern ceremony over at the T Bridge in Hiroshima. If you've never been there, where there's you stand in a line and you get the materials to make your own floating paper lanterns. You can write messages on them. You put them in the water. There's survivors there, media, a lot of people there. And I remember going through that line with these new Japanese friends I had, and kind of all of the guilt, all of the anger that I had through those couple of weeks built up, and I just lost it. And I was just sobbing, and I was just asking for forgiveness. And actually, one of the atomic bomb survivors that I'm so close with to this day, Koko Kondo, Reverend Kiyoshi Tenemoto's daughter, she kind of swooped down and consoled me. And it's crazy because I go back to Japan pretty much every year, and I'll go there, and I think after all these years, I'm going to be okay. And then I get to the lantern ceremony, it just doesn't matter. I'll just fall apart all over again. Like I'll just never be okay going there. So when I came back, I remember just thinking, I have to put these two passions of mine together, eliminating racism and eliminating nuclear weapons. And how do I do it? And that started, the entire process for me.
Thanks, Vincent. Art, do you want to say anything about what got you moving?
Well, it really was the Holy Spirit and meeting great peacemakers and resistors like Hansberry Day. And and then just going to the electric boat shipyard where the Trident submarines are being built. I grew up an hour away from electric boat in Hartford, Connecticut, and I couldn't believe what was going on when I went there to that shipyard. And then in 1978, I had an opportunity to actually meet the Habakasha, who were in New York at the UN, pleading to the world during the first UN special session on disarmament to abolish nuclear weapons and to not let the sin be repeated. And that for me was a major turning point. Here were the Habakasha appealing to the world to abolish this sin of nuclear weapons. And in my home state, in Connecticut, the Trident submarines are being built. The ultimate first strike weapon, the Trident. And so that led me to really be involved full time. And as both Vincent and Vicki have shared so beautifully and powerfully, you know, committing my life to really abolishing war and racism and economic exploitation, the destruction of our earth. And to do that with communities of people of faith through the Plowshares movement, through the Catholic Worker, through the Atlantic Life community, Pacific Life community, and many other resistors, many of whom have spent time, as I have, and has Steve Baggerly has done this in this session, and others too, I'm sure, in this session, spending time in prison for acts of nonviolent resistance to the nuclear empire. And so I will never forget the being on top of the Trident submarine. The Thames River Plowshares action. We were hammering and pouring blood, and Vincent, get this, we brought with us a video of the aftermath of the bombing of Hiroshima as evidence about why we were acting to make sure that nuclear weapons and the Trident, of course, would never be used. And we wanted to bring that evidence into court to show the jury and to show the world why we need to abolish nuclear weapons. And that evidence was not permitted, of course. But we did what we could to explain why we were hammering on the Trident, why we poured our blood on it, and why we brought with us that video and the plea of the Habakasha to abolish nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Art. I hope each of us has a story as personal as to why we got involved. There's a number of questions in the chat. I'm going to start with one that first appeared as a comment or a suggestion from Bob Ziegler, which is it realistic to believe that Biden could actually follow Catholic Church teaching? Or does the problem require the conversion of more than the US president? Factually, Biden could follow US teaching and does in a number of areas, Catholic Church teaching. Whether it's realistic is another question. Anybody want to take a shot at that? Vincent.
I just, you know, I do the same thing. When I look at Biden, I do the same things I do with Obama, whereas, you know, President Obama did a number of good things, but he also did a number of things that, you know, I disagree with. He signed on for the $1 trillion modernization, of course. He didn't take off hair trigger alert. He didn't eliminate as many as I wanted. All true things, but I don't put it on him. I put it on us. He never said, yes, I can. He said, yes, we can. And if we, again, had millions in the streets demanding this issue, then we could move the needle, I think. And it's the same thing with Biden. Biden's not going to act on his own. It's on us to push Biden in that regard. And so, you know, I think in terms of when you mention Catholics or just religion as a whole, to me, it's insane that anybody with a straight face can say they're pro-life and then be okay with nuclear weapons, right? So, and it's looking out and saying, okay, to me, it's all these different places in which, how can we get more people involved in this, right? We should be tabling at every cancer walk in the United States and then explaining what nuclear weapons does with cancer, right? We should be, there's so many different avenues that we should be into. But again, the other thing is for Biden is, I remember I gave a talk in Syracuse, New York, a couple of years ago, and the crowd that was there largely agreed with me and said, yeah, I'm not in favor of nuclear weapons. I agree with you. Problem is the main employer in Syracuse, New York is Lockheed Martin. So to them, it's a jobs program. They don't care what they're building. They need a paycheck. It's like coal miners in West Virginia. They get them a new job. So you also have to figure out that piece of it as well as in terms of jobs. You have a nuclear lobby that is also gigantic. So there's just so many factors that go into this. And I think we have to look at it in different ways, right? So there's the education piece, but I also think there's a lobbying piece too. I mean, what I write about and what I looked at is for a long time, it was the Congressional Black Caucus that was at the forefront of this issue. It was Ron Dellums that was going to Utah to try to get Spencer Kimball, the Mormon Church, to say no to Reagan's MX missile and building it there. You have Shirley Chisholm, you had Jesse Jackson when he ran 84 and 88. You had Black politicians where they really, Harold Washington, Chicago, that put this front and center. And I think we need to push to get back to that as well, beyond just Barbara Lee and some of the others. So, the answer is I don't think Biden will do it alone. I don't think Biden just with his faith will do it alone. It's going to be on us to push Biden and champion him when he does something good and then push him when he's not. The problem with Biden, the biggest problem I see is the collective sense of relief everybody has because it's no longer Trump. And to me, that's dangerous, right? So everybody goes, okay, Trump, the madman, the authoritarian, the outright racist is gone. So somehow I can breathe a sigh of relief because Biden's not crazy enough to use nuclear weapons. So now I don't have to care about this issue anymore. And we fall into a level of complacency when it's still no one human being should have the ability to end life on the planet. Not Biden, not Trump, not anybody. And so that's the fear, because I saw heightened awareness during those Trump years that I saw that you can compare to the 80s, the early 80s with Reagan. But then you just saw it go right away when he was out. And so that's my big fear of what can happen with a Biden presidency.
Thanks. I'll just underline that by pointing out that the huge Sane Freeze rally of 1982 was one of the events that convinced Ronald Reagan that the Star Wars or Strategic Defense Initiative wasn't enough and that he had actually to negotiate reductions, and the reductions were massive.
Nick, that's the book I'm writing now. And I interviewed Leslie Kagan and Cora Weiss and Helen Caldecott and so many others for the book, and looking at, did that influence him? And, when you look at people inside the White House, even though publicly they were saying, no, we don't care about what these people are doing. Privately they were saying, look, this is a PR nightmare. We have got to change our way here. Even Nancy Reagan was saying, look, you've got to change here. And it's unfortunate that at the golden hour when we could have eliminated nuclear weapons, and Gorbachev wanted to, that Reagan, refused to get rid of this ridiculous Star Wars, but at least we got the INF treaty out of this. And again, for so many people today, if you ask them what got them started, it was either, in many ways, the fear of Reagan and or the June 12th rally. That kind of got them to raise that anti-nuclear banner for a lot of them. So yeah, you're absolutely correct.
Thanks. I want to build off that. Perlette Springer, who is with PCART, asks, what is the plan for Pax Christi USA, or anybody really, to engage people of color in addressing this issue? I think it's yours, Vince. You're muted. You need to unmute.
No, I lost you for a second. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
I got you back. I'm back now. So I'm sorry. The question was, how does Pax Christi or anybody get more people of color involved in this issue? That's what I'm hearing. Yeah. Again, there's not a silver bullet here. The reality is, for so long, communities of color have been dismissed on this issue. And there's been internal racism within organizations like Women Strike for Peace and saying and that we have to, you know, in the arms control community, we're starting to see a reckoning as well, and with the think tank world and the racism that's gone on. So you have to, you know, there's not one set message. When I'm dealing with students or younger folks of color, especially, and I'm working with them on this issue, that, you know, one thing is I see a lot of people in the disarmament world, you know, talking at them. Don't you understand this is the most existential threat of your life? Well, to my Black students, it's not. The most existential threat to their life is being killed by the police on the way to school. So you can't, you know, just assume that this is what's on, you know, again, that they're saying to me, look at Prof, I'm trying to put food on the table. I'm taking care of my family. I'm paying student loans. I'm trying to get a degree. I'm hoping the police don't kill me. Working 2 jobs. Oh, and by the way, you want me to stop nuclear war? Cool. You know, how am I going to do that? So you have to like sit there and go, okay, maybe to somebody I'm going to relate to them with sports. Because now we have the more socially conscious athlete with Kaepernick and Carmelo and others. And when we think of socially conscious athletes, we often think in the past of the 68 Olympics, right? With Tommy Smith and John Carlos or Muhammad Ali, of course, but there were also athletes united for peace. There were athletes throughout the 1980s, Black athletes that were fighting to get rid of nuclear weapons, you know, and you need to explain them. A lot of times students, they look for themselves in history, somebody they can relate to, somebody that shares an ancestry with them, you know, and so whether it's Bayard Rustin or whether they look at Malcolm X, and they realize Malcolm cared about this issue. Wait, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale cared about this issue? Then they are invested. Oh, you know, there's a great new book that came out on Lorraine Hansberry that looks about everything else she did beyond Raising in the Sun and talks about her influence in this issue and how she was influenced by Jimmy Baldwin to get involved in the nuclear movement. And so people then okay, I want to be involved in this issue. For some, it's music. And I relate to them with hip hop and those in the hip hop community that actually have songs about nuclear weapons and have mentioned this, and then they can connect. And so you have to kind of tailor that whole thing. But one thing for younger folks in general is to make it cool. And I know that sounds, you know, in some ways trivial, but it's not. Nuclear weapons can come off as boring. You're not going to relate to them with ICBMs and no first use talk. You know, one of the brilliant things about the freeze movement was how simplistic Randy Forsberg made the actual freeze resolution. People could relate to it. And like Vicki said, they felt they could do something about it. That's the beauty of ICANN, right? It's simplistic in its nature. This is what it is and what you can do about it, right? And lastly, I'll say that one thing we need to do is, you know, where I teach now, my classes are about 50% African from all various parts of the continent, 49% African-American, and 1% other. And when I start my classes, my students from Africa will say, we're told not to hang out with African-American students. They droop their pants. They don't study. They're lazy. They're not us. We're African. And then my African-American students will say, don't call me African. I'm from Anacostia in DC. African booty scratcher, that's a diss. I'm not African. And then my Ethiopian students will say, don't call me West African. We're kings and queens. We were never colonized. We're not like them. And then I have to explain that when a nuclear weapon goes off or a cop is beating their ass, they're not first waiting and saying, wait a minute, are you from Cameroon or are you from Anacostia? No, they're beating them because they're Black. And realizing how their fight is all connected under the lens of colonialism and race. And it's stunning that by the end of the class, instead of saying they and them, I catch them start saying we, right? And we've had that throughout history. You have had Pan-Africanism, you know, whether it was through the 30s and 40s, through Marcus Garvey in the 20s with the Harlem Renaissance. You know, you have it again in the Black Arts Movement of the 60s, this connection of all people of color and being united, right? There was an affinity and a connection between African Americans and the Japanese before Pearl Harbor ever happened. Whether it was through internment or whether it was through the Japanese wanting to come to the aid of Ethiopia when Italy invaded, Mussolini invaded in 35. You had a Pan-Africanist movement in terms of the golden era of hip hop, where you had people wearing African medallions and the red, black, and green flag and things of this nature. And perhaps we need to get back to that. and showing how people of color, the power they have and how they are united. And again, I refer back to ICANN and how that treaty shows that. Here's the global South coming together and saying, no, we're not dealing with this, and how it's related to us. So I think that's another thing that we need to look at when we're saying, how do we get people of color, especially our younger folks, more involved and invested in this issue?
Thanks.
Yeah,
again.
could I add something
Art.
too? I think it's very, very important to, I mentioned several times in my sharing too about how nuclear weapons prop up this imperial system of white supremacy and military domination in the world. The empire relies on the bomb to enforce its will on controlling and dominating peoples of color everywhere. And so that's key. And then also I wanted to bring in my dear late friend Damu Smith. And I don't know if Vincent ever...
Absolutely, yes, of course.
Damu was a very close friend, and we did work together and supported each other. And he was a great voice. He's a founder of Black Voices for Peace. And he died in 2005. And so I want to bring him into the presence. And also, I've been, and many other Catholic workers have been involved with the Poor People's Campaign, and how important that campaign is to bring together all the triple evils that Dr. King spoke of, in addition to environmental devastation, and to make those connections all the time in the work that we're doing. And then lastly, whenever I've been in jail, I mean, this is where you see the racism at its most evil manifestation, because we're there with prisoners, and usually for those of us who have been in prison who are white, we realize we're a very small minority in the prison, which is run by white people, but all the prisoners are people of color. And so the conversations and the relationships that I've made over the years with people of color in prison and jail have been very, very powerful. And then I just wanted to say something too about the churches. The churches, if we were to take in the U.S. Catholic Church Pope Francis seriously, when he says the possession of nuclear weapons are immoral, that means, as I said, we can't have nuclear weapons. Nobody can be involved in their production or use. And so what if the U.S. Catholic bishops, were to make an appeal to all Catholics saying no Catholic can participate ever again in using nuclear weapons or building them or paying for them, and that's where we come in. That's where Pax Christi comes in, the Catholic work, all the people of faith, to call on the church leadership to really implement this great pronouncement that Pope Francis made. He's the first pope that's ever condemned the possession of nukes as immoral. Other popes have made similar statements, but never. The possession of the weapons are immoral, and that's very key to pressing Biden and all other Catholic politicians. Let's not forget Nancy Pelosi. The Speaker of the House is Catholic as well. And, they all need to understand that we can no longer possess these weapons. Therefore, we have to abolish them. And therefore, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons has to become the rallying cry, for the U.S. Catholics and all Catholics around the world, especially in the nuclear nations.
Thank you. I'd like to break out of the panel because I noticed in the chat that people have been in a dialogue with Perlette. Maybe Perlette, not everybody reads the chat, I know. So maybe you might kind of summarize your thoughts on the question you asked.
I don't know how to summarize, but my question is, because PCARD is doing a workshop later this afternoon, but one of the questions leads to how do we engage people of color is because how do we change the makeup of Pax Christi so we are a more diverse community, which means we can reach more people as a diverse community, and we can engage more people as a diverse community. And so if we reach out to more people of color community and connect the dots, right, we build more community, because if each one can connect to 10 people, you know, you can use math to figure out how many people um, how many people will be encountered. Um, and and so that's why I'm trying to reach is how do we engage other people of color communities, Blacks, Hispanics, Asians, in this issue. And the best way to do that is to connect the dots, you know, and we can't go with the stereotype that, well, the sports figures and the entertainment figures are activists, but I'm not into sports, you know. I don't follow entertainment, and a lot of the college graduates that I know of, whether they're Black, Hispanic, or Asian, you know, you're not going to reach us through sports and entertainment, you know, so you have to figure out to know your audience and how do you reach out and connect the dots. Say, hey, this is an issue that intersects with a lot of other issues. Um, and it intersects with your life too, no matter how busy your life is, you know, this is a priority issue because it can wipe all of us out on the face of the earth.
Thanks. Thanks, Perlette. I would just add, it helps a lot to talk to people one-to-one. A quick story from my church. There was a group that overlapped considerably with the Pax Christi group, and they wanted to reach out to the marginalized members of the community. And then they started thinking about how they could do this. And about 30 minutes into their discussion, somebody said, you know, half our parishioners are brown people who speak Spanish, and we have a Spanish mass. Maybe we should start by going to that mass. So look around. White people have a tendency not to see people of color when they're right next to them. The other thing I want to add here, and we only have about 5 minutes, is build coalitions. Pax Christi in Washington State is part of a coalition that includes the Poor People's Campaign, 350.org, Veterans for Peace, loads of different organizations, and we work together to try to abolish nuclear weapons. Let's see. At this point, with about 5 minutes left, I have to reach out and think there's loads of, so there was a question much earlier about how do we reach out to young people? And Vincent kind of talked a little bit about that. I have to say, in my experience, the biggest problem is the Cold War ended. And so people who were born right around the time the Cold War ended are very unaware of the nuclear threat. And it's very hard to grab their attention because a survey that was done noted that for people, millennials, I'll say in shorthand, although that's not quite right, nuclear weapons, yes, are a threat, but the threat that they actually see is climate change, and they don't see the nuclear weapons. And so that's kind of the problem. Any responses from the panel?
I mean, one thing climate change did right, though, is climate change, climate change was really good in marketing. They made it cool. And secondly, they realized that for kids to get involved, they needed a victory and they needed something tangible. And for them, it was Keystone Pipeline. We knew Keystone wasn't the be all end all of climate change. It's not. But it was something physical and tangible that they could say, if we can get behind this and stop this, we won. We stopped this machine. And they did, right? That's harder to do with nuclear weapons, right? Because if you say, oh, we're going to try to stop ICBMs or something, that's a whole nother thing. The other piece is education. My kids, freshmen and sophomores in college, should not be coming into my class never learning anything about the atomic bombings and never have reading John Hershey's Hiroshima. So we have to try to figure out how to go way back and get this in the curriculum and get these kids learning about this issue before they get to college, right? And that's another piece that we have to think about, is how do we get this in? One way is stop siloing STEM from humanities, right? So if you are studying physics, or science in your classes, you have to be studying humanities and philosophy and religion and all of these things around the bomb. And if you're studying humanities, again, same thing, you need to learn about Einstein and you need to learn about all of these things that went into the bomb and why, how it affects you and so on and so forth, right? But we continuously do that in our education, is siloing these two pieces, which is just the wrong approach. I mean, so there, a lot of it is, you know, reaching them is starting very early with education. And now it's even harder to do that because we're, again, under such threat of you know, only having this tunnel vision, multiple choice tests, don't deviate from this, right? So my kids, oftentimes when they come in, they'll say, Professor, we learned nothing about the atomic bombings. What we learn ad nauseum is the Holocaust. And why are they learning that? Because it's easy for the US to say Germany's the bad guys. We were the good guys. We were the liberators. So don't blame us, blame Germany, right? And the bomb, you have to blame us. We're the ones that did it. We have to actually deal with that. We have to deal with what slavery, we have to deal with that. And we don't want to do that. So again, we ignore those things and kids don't learn about it. And that's a big piece of how why they're not interested.
Thanks again. I have to say we only have a couple of minutes left. So unfortunately, although there are a lot more things that have come up in the chat, I hope you'll all save the file. We are going to be directed back to the main room in about a minute and a half. So I want to have time to say thank you to our three panelists, to Vicki, to Vincent, and to Art. I want to remind you that in the fall, Pax Christi will be looking at Art's book, The Risk of the Cross, which includes tons of information, not only some of the numbers and some of the history, but also links to media presentations that can be useful, links to some of the activist groups that Art mentioned in his presentation, and books and everything else. So thank you for being here. And particularly thanks to Heather Navarro for being the tech person and keeping me in line. I think we're going to be sent back momentarily. Thank you to all of you who are here. It's so good to see so many people I've worked with over the years. And I look forward to a long haul, but just as we reduce the total number of nuclear weapons by tens of thousands, we can reduce the 14,000 or so that currently exist to zero. Thanks very much. And I think I'm going to have to end this session at any time now. So
thank you, Nick. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, Vincent. And thanks for everybody who's been part of this session.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Make sure you join actions on August 6th and 9th.
Oh, yes. Okay, I think everybody should leave and go back to the main room. Otherwise, Johnny will come after me.
Okay.
Not violently, but.
Bless you, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your preparation, for responding See you all.